Hi, everybody. This is our final session of the Stand By You Early Learning Series for parents of preschool children. And today we are going to be looking at the science of reading and then also some tips for how to get your child ready for kindergarten. And as I said in the email, we're doing this particular meeting completely virtual. I do apologize. My daughter had the, the to be taken out of school today because somebody in her class had been exposed to COVID, and so she had to be quarantined, and so I'm having to work from home today. So I do apologize for us not having the live meeting. Let me go to my next slide here. Just a quick agenda. Welcome back to everybody. We're going to do some review of what we discussed in our last meeting, and then we're going to also look, as I said, at the science of reading, and then some tips for kindergarten readiness, and then we'll have some time for some questions and review. To review, I've given you the guys this idea multiple times now. But I wholeheartedly believe that learning occurs through a very scientific process of fake it until you make it. The idea here being that children need to have opportunities to play and act out the things that they are learning so that they have the opportunity to own that learning. It helps them to make connections to prior experiences, to current experiences, so that they literally build the wiring of their little minds. And everything that you've ever learned in your entire life, you've learned through this fake it until you make it process. And so we certainly need to give children the opportunity to do this as well. As we said last time when we were talking about the knowledge gap, our American approach to early education has had a large focus on reading. Reading being a term used to encompass not just matching letters to sounds, but also comprehension, which is the ability to understand text. But that in our reading setting is being taught as a set of skills that's often taught disconnected from content. So we're teaching them how to do something like, for example, infer meaning from a text, looking at different strategies for doing that, but that's often disconnected from learning about specific content in social studies, history, science, and that kind of thing. Through third grade, children spend their time learning to read before they can progress to reading to learn. And this is a very popular idea across our education settings that, the main focus in those early grades is getting students to the point that by the end of third grade, they are reading proficiently so that they can then use that newfound literacy ability to enhance their learning in the grades going forward. And as we said last week, one of the big problems with that is if we wait until fourth grade to really begin connecting students to content in these different subject areas, the students don't have that foundation to build that reading comprehension upon. You can't infer meaning from text unless you've had prior experiences, whether they be real life or experiences reading about things, to connect back to, unless you've had those things. And so this idea of reading to learn after fourth grade has perpetuated this idea that science and social studies can wait, and that the focus has to be on those reading skills that will equip them to acquire knowledge later. And so reading has long dominated the early years. In 1977, early elementary teachers were spending more than twice as much time on reading as science and social studies combined. By 2001, No Child Left Behind is requiring those annual reading and math tests that only amplified that focus on reading in school. And by 2012, teachers were reporting an average of 16 minutes a day on social studies and 19 on science, with the literacy block being between 90 minutes and 3 hours, with the huge focus being on those standardized tests that they're being held accountable to. And so this is a problem because the science and social studies, which typically is so engaging to learners, for one thing, in the early grades, they love learning about the world and how it works. And the ability to have that prior background knowledge to build future learning upon is being diminished because there's not enough focus on content. And as I said, testing, up to a quarter of the school year spent preparing for tests, or taking benchmark tests. Arne Duncan, who was a prior Secretary of Education under President Obama, by the end of his term, is admitting that testing had gotten out of hand. And so Congress stepped in and did away with No Child Left Behind in 2015 and brought in ESSA, or the Every Student Succeeds Act, which was set to reduce the consequences of those annual test scores so that teachers had more autonomy to make decisions about how to best teach their students. Unfortunately, the testing culture was so ingrained in our schools, ESSA's had very little impact on removing that testing. So there's been no reduction in the amount of testing. And so the results of this is that for more than 20 years, about 2/3 of our students consistently scored below the proficient level, in spite of all this focus on that reading block. Only 18% of 8th graders scored proficient in U.S. history, 23% in civics, and 27% in geography. And again, guys, that's because they're not getting enough early learning content to build the learning that they're having in 8th grade upon to really be successful with that. A 2014 study showing that students on one college campus didn't know simple things like who won the Civil War, who the vice president was, and what country the U.S. won independence from. And so we are producing, albeit literate people, through our efforts in the early grades with reading. In some cases, even in the cases that we're producing literate people, we're producing illiterate literates. Basically, the idea, they know how to read, but they're really not doing much with it. And that's a problem. And so many adults are unable to even determine between reliable and unreliable online sources. And this is literally creating a threat to our democracy. And so last week we talked about the knowledge gap. Some other terms that we call this: achievement gap, opportunity gap, test score gap. But the idea here is that our test scores for low income and minority students tend to consistently be far below their more affluent peers. And the types of things that we're doing in our schools are not doing enough to really make up for that distance. And studies are suggesting that students with low test scores are less likely to pursue higher education, keep jobs, provide for their families, exercise civic responsibility, or lead fulfilling lives. And so literally the quality of life of our students going forward is impacted when we don't connect young people to the kinds of experiences, to the kinds of content in science and social studies and so forth that they need. And guys, I'm not saying that we need to throw out the reading block, but what I am saying is that our schools need to be moving to a model of teaching content-rich curriculum in those earliest of grades, and not spending so much time on those literacy skills like inferring meaning from a text. We also talked about how when a child is reading, all of the systems of strategic action is happening. That the idea that reading literally is thinking. And when you're thinking, you're doing a lot of complicated things all at the same time. And so basically within the systems of strategic actions, you've got 3 areas: thinking within the text. That's where the student is like really focusing on what they're reading, decoding the words, monitoring, correcting, when you're reading, maybe you mispronounce something or read a word incorrectly, noticing things like that, making those adjustments and that kind of thing, looking for the information that you're trying to get from the text. Thinking beyond the text is that whole idea of um, getting students to move towards comprehension. And so that's where they're inferring that meaning from the text, they're synthesizing ideas, making connections to prior experiences, other books that they've read. And then sometimes we see students actually predicting what's going to come next in the text. And then the third area is thinking about the text. And that's where you're critiquing, analyzing, do I like this? How does it compare to other things? All that kind of thing. The good news for you as parents, and even for us as educators, is that we don't really have to focus on each component of this, because students are going to do a lot of these things naturally just as they're reading along in the text. And again, if we take time to teach each one of these skills, oftentimes we get no real gains or benefit from that. And if we're doing that at the expense of connecting them to content, we're further handicapping them and perpetuating the knowledge gap. So today we're moving to a focus of the science of reading. We've done a lot of talking in this series about engaging children in play-based settings. I did a whole session on engaging students in the behavior of good readers, getting them to do that fake it until you make it process of what it looks like to become a good reader, celebrating their successes, all that kind of thing. And so today we're wanting to move to that level where we've engaged them in all those literacy behaviors through doing lots of interactive reading and writing with children. And now we're diving into how do we specifically decode those words on those letters on the page to understand the words and then get to meaning. And so what is the science of reading? This term science of reading refers to the research that reading experts, especially cognitive scientists, have conducted on how we learn to read. So this is the body of knowledge that really has been built over the past about 20 years that's based off of very sound research methodologies. They've gone in and they've tested and tested again, and they have found the specific methods of reading instruction that are producing the best results in terms of students learning to read. All students, and especially these students that are experiencing this opportunity or knowledge gap. The problem is that a lot of our teachers tend to teach the way that they were traditionally taught. Even though they've gone to college and they've learned a lot of things about what they should be doing in terms of instruction, specifically literacy instruction, oftentimes that experience they had as a student themselves is so big in their minds, it's very hard for them to get past that and to teach in different ways. Now, that's not to say that there aren't professional educators out there doing a great job, because there certainly is. But what we need is a body of educators that understand the science of reading. And so for you as parents, I'm sharing this information so that you can be an advocate for your child moving forward. Hopefully you will be able to have your child in a really content-rich environment that with a teacher that understands the science of reading. If your teacher is a graduate of MSU, Meridian, they certainly have gotten a lot of training in the science of reading. So a big component of this science of reading is the phonics approach. Based on the science of reading, a 2000 National Reading Panel report stated that students need explicit instruction in the essential components of reading. And those essential components are phonological awareness. That's a big word, phonological. All that means is an awareness of the sounds of speech. And guys, this is before they even begin decoding and reading the words on the page. This simply comes from oral language. You can have phonological awareness with your eyes closed. It's just the ability to pick out those distinct sounds in words. For example, fish, picking up that f sound on the beginning of that word. That's something that you could be doing with your children as you're having conversations, as they're looking at pictures in a book. If it's a picture of a fish, you can help them to recognize that sound on the very beginning of that word. That's phonological awareness. And we know that phonological awareness is a powerful undergirder in terms of getting our children ready for the next step, which is decoding. And that's where phonics comes in. Then ultimately, we're building towards fluency. And that's simply where instead of slowly sounding out the words, the child is moving to the point to where they can read it fluently. They're able to have a good pace. They're not getting stalled out on particular sounds along the way and having to stop and figure those out, but they're able to kind of read at a really good natural rate. Great way to get a child to a fluency is to give them some really good decodable readers that they can practice reading with you, and then you doing a lot of reading aloud and reading fluently in front of them. Big, powerful ways to get them to that. Then, of course, there's vocabulary. That's just understanding the meaning of words. And we've talked before about that interactive read aloud where you stop along the way, particularly with those big words that you know your child doesn't understand, and you just simply stop and talk about what does that word mean. The bigger your child develops in terms of vocabulary, the better they're going to be able to do this next component, which is the ultimate goal of reading, and that is reading comprehension. The end game with reading is to be able to pick up a text, read it, and understand what it means. And so that's what we're trying to accomplish with this phonics approach. Now, I will add a caveat here. Another side goal of reading beyond comprehension is the love of reading. If you try to teach reading out of the context of meaning, out of the context of really good literature, out of the context of those close personal interactions like we've talked about before, and the opportunity to have authentic experiences with literacy, that fake it until you make it, playing with the ideas, acting out the stories, all those kinds of things, then you really haven't accomplished something. A number of years ago, my child was in, I believe it was first grade by this point, and I was not liking some of the things I was seeing about the curriculum and things that were coming home. And so I began doing my own research into it. And I found this research packet that was actually produced by the curriculum company itself. This particular company had done some research and they were sharing their evidence to say, this is why our particular curriculum is the best curriculum to use. The problem was, though, that they had this claim based off of their research that our children that are taught with this particular curriculum, they have higher test scores and higher literacy mastery than did the control group. But then there was this little sub thing. And again, guys, this was the curriculum company that's trying to sell this curriculum. So this had to be powerful enough of information that they felt like they needed to include this in their materials. And the statement was that compared to the control group, that's the other group that got whatever curriculum, the students that got our curriculum did not have as much of a desire to read once they were able to read. So what this curriculum company found is while they could produce the test scores and the literate children, what they could not do was facilitate that love for reading. And guys, a child that knows how to read but hates reading is not going to use that reading ability to their benefit. So we really want to develop both in our children. We want to protect that desire to learn and that desire to read. At the same time, we want to get them along this path of literacy. So the phonics approach teaches children to begin reading by manipulating the sounds and words, or actually sounding out those words. As I said before, a big thing that you can be doing as a parent to get your child ready for this phonics in school is by helping them to recognize those phonemes, that phonological awareness. Just simply breaking down the sounds of speech and recognizing those more individual units of words. And again, phonological awareness is something that you and your child can do with your eyes closed. They don't have to be looking at print to do that. What they need to be able to do is to understand that that sound at the beginning of a word represents an individual unit in the speech sound that will ultimately connect to the printed information that we're decoding. That's phonemic awareness. So on the other side of this phonics approach is this balanced literacy approach. And they actually call this the reading wars between phonics and between balanced literacy. And simply, balanced literacy is a strategy that evolved from this whole language approach that used to be taught in our schools. And the assumption there is that children learn to read if they're given the good books and taught the cues and strategies to support reading. Again, that system of strategic actions, we just teach them these strategies and they're going to pick up this reading. And there was no focus on really breaking down those words and understanding those smaller units of the words. And so, again, educators tend to do what they've seen. This has been a method that's been popular with educators for many years. And the focus here is that part I was just talking to you about, facilitating that love of books and reading. The problem is a balanced literacy approach does not provide the kind of structured phonics that's necessary for students to really get in and understand how to decode the words. And so what we want to do is for you guys as parents, as they're getting ready for school, give them all these really great experiences with books where you're reading aloud to them in a very interactive way. And you guys are setting the stage for that love of reading, and then beginning that process of phonemic awareness, them understanding those speech sounds and that kind of thing. And then as they're ready, you also helping them to pick out those speech sounds and begin to decode some very simple words and begin reading some decodable books so that by the time that they get into school and they have a structured literacy program that has explicit instruction in phonics, they are going to be best ready. Now, the other key component to all of this is what we talked about last week, is your children having had a lot of really robust experiences to build all this reading learning upon. So taking them places, taking them to the Children's Museum to interact with the exhibits there, taking them to the children's shows at the Riley Center, taking your child on a trip to the beach or to the state park or to the lake or that kind of thing, taking them to where they can see animals, all kinds of different real life experiences with you are going to be really powerful things for them to build that future learning upon. And then the other side of that is picking out some books that aren't just all storybooks. There's really great storybooks out there, and children love storybooks that are written just for them. But there's also some really great subject-based books, nonfiction books, things about basic science concepts, things about people and places and that kind of thing. So also thinking about that. And guys, you can get a lot of those resources from your local library. So there's really no lack of access to those materials to provide those experiences. So I have a video here that we're going to watch for a few minutes that focuses on this idea of the science of reading. And it just kind of basically helps you as a parent to better understand what has been happening with this reading war and why it's so important that we move in this science of reading direction.
In 2013, Attila Gawande wrote a piece for The New Yorker about slow ideas. These are ideas that, despite mounds of evidence and research, fail to take off. Gawande tells the story of the inception of anesthesia and antiseptics. Both were seen as promising new ideas in the mid-1860s, but only one of these groundbreaking developments took off. It was anesthesia. Anesthesia addressed an immediate issue, pain during surgery. Antiseptics, however, addressed an invisible problem, germs. Antiseptics were not adopted until a generation later. Slow ideas have always been with us. Climate change. Too much sugar is bad for you. Think about how long it took to convince people that seatbelts save lives. As a teacher, I'm here today to talk to you about another long-simmering slow idea. Structured phonics is the most effective way to teach children how to read. Phonics is connecting the sounds from our oral language to the letters or groups of letters that represent those sounds in an alphabetic writing system. Human beings learn to speak in the early years of life. Babies develop speech as they hear it from their caregivers. Speaking is intuitive to humans. We have been speaking for so long that our brains have evolved a language center. We are hardwired for speech, which means that given adequate exposure to oral language, we will become proficient in its use, no instruction required. However, we are not hardwired to read. Our brains need explicit instruction that literally rewires it, creating connections that would not otherwise exist. In public schools today, we teach reading as if it is as natural as speaking. We teach reading as if it is a skill to absorb, not a skill to be explicitly taught. Currently, we teach children letter sounds, sight words to memorize, and encourage them to use context, such as pictures, to decipher words. This method is known as balanced literacy, and it has been the most commonly used method to teach reading since the 1980s. Essentially, children are presented with some knowledge and then are left to create meaning from that knowledge. Let me give you an example. When I taught kindergarten, I would give my students small books called leveled readers. Within the pages of these books were words that corresponded with pictures on the page. As we would get ready to read, as the teacher, I would use a series of cues or prompts to guide my students. So if the sentence was, "I have a pet cat," I would remind my students that they knew the words I and have as sight words. I would then maybe encourage them to get their mouth ready to say the p in pet. I would then usually point to the picture of the cat to draw their attention to that. With enough cues, the students would recite the words. The next year, I jumped up to 4th grade, where it became quickly apparent that many of my students did not have any strategies for sounding out longer words. The pictures were gone, and the guessing strategies no longer worked because the text was too complex. As a teacher, I should have known how to help them, but I didn't know because I had never been taught. That feeling of frustration led me down the road to structured phonics. Structured phonics involves teaching all letter sounds, how those sounds work together, and how to break those sounds apart. This is probably the point in the talk where you are wondering, this all sounds familiar. Are you sure we don't teach phonics in schools? Well, like everything in education, it's a little bit more complicated than it should be. Yes, all schools teach phonics, but most schools do not teach a structured and systematic phonics curriculum. Throughout the 80s and 90s, reading scores began to fall so much that Congress convened a national reading panel to look at all of the reading research up until that point. The evidence was clear. Structured phonics was the most effective way to teach children how to read. It led to the greatest gains in reading accuracy for children. Study after study shows that phonics in the early grades works. And yet, we are still teaching children to read with the balanced literacy method. Reading scores have barely budged in 30 years, and people of color and low-income people have suffered the most. In 2019, the National Assessment for Educational Progress revealed data that showed that only 37% of American 12th graders were reading proficiently. Only 15% of Black 12th graders were reading proficiently. Now, this is news to you, but this is not news in education circles. The data has looked like this for the past 30 years. So this begs the question, why do we ignore this data? Do we really believe that people have a civil right to read? Now, we often only talk about children when we talk about reading research, but those children become adults. Today's struggling reader is tomorrow's partially illiterate adult. Illiterate is a very strong word, one often reserved for developing nations, but illiteracy is alive and well here in the United States. Only 48% of adults are reading at a level that allows them to identify and interpret information that is lengthy and complicated. And 14% of adults cannot read well enough to fill out a job application. Reading poorly as an adult means that going to vocational school or college or entering the workforce will be exponentially more difficult. And the ramifications extend far beyond employment. How does a person with such low skills understand a health diagnosis and participate in their own health care? How does that person read their own mail or a rental agreement? How does that person read a ballot initiative? That individual's pain has and will continue to become our collective pain, because when an adult does not read well, it impacts their economy, the public health, and our democracy. Phonics advocates have been sounding the alarm for years, but changing the way we teach reading is a very slow idea. So let's take a look at what it would take to switch from a balanced literacy method to a structured phonics method. Number one, train education professors in the science of reading. Number two, schools of education need to train teachers in training. And number three, school districts will need to adopt and purchase new curriculum and train existing teachers accordingly. Practically everyone involved would need to abandon their old ways. And for many, balanced literacy is the only theory and method that they know. We would put in a lot of difficult and expensive work for an eventual reward. Now, some states are well on this path due to legislation that has essentially forced a change. However, we know with other social and cultural movements, the legislation is only a part. For an issue to be successful, you must have buy-in. You must talk about it and give the idea a lot of oxygen. And the good news is that this is happening. Teachers across the country are talking about the need for phonics. Once hushed conversations are now out in the open. Parent advocacy groups have sprung up across the nation, and legislation has passed in multiple states that is bringing evidence-based teaching back to the classroom. The idea is picking up speed. So where do we go from here? Well, it's important to note that phonics will not solve all reading comprehension issues. Poverty, trauma, vocabulary instruction, and content knowledge all play a role. But shouldn't we start somewhere? Instructional methods are something that schools can actually control. In 2015, the state of Mississippi decided to get serious about raising reading scores. Legislation allocated money for all elementary teachers to be retrained in the science of reading and phonics instruction. Guess which state was the only state to make reading gains in 2019? How can we make phonics a nationwide movement and not a piecemeal state-by-state intervention? Well, I am a firm believer that we can do this through education, legislation, and old-fashioned grassroots organizing. We have to keep talking about this issue, and we need to keep asking the question, why do we ignore the data? Why are we okay with poor reading scores? If you feel inspired today to see this idea come to light, go talk to someone. Your child's teacher, a school district administrator, the director of a school of education. Because we can no longer sit back and rely on adult literacy programs and prison volunteers to teach our fellow human beings how to read. At the end of the day, this is not about teaching children. This is about teaching future adults. Yes, children need to read in order to learn, but adults need to read in order to live, to participate in society, to be a citizen. So help us move this slow idea along, because school years come to an end, our students move on, and typically we have no idea what happens to them. All we have is the data. And we can turn that data around because we know what works. The research is abundant and clear. Phonics is an idea worth spreading. Thank you.
So as I said before, students that attend MSU Meridian are being taught in the science of reading. I've had the benefit of participating in a fellowship that we've done here in Mississippi with literacy faculty across the state to make sure everybody has this understanding of the science of reading. So we're very blessed in Mississippi that we're seeing a lot of really positive changes around this happening. And Mississippi is being recognized as a leader in the nation in this area. Now, she did mention there, and I want to point out that the science of reading and phonics will not solve every problem in terms of literacy. We still have that knowledge gap problem that we talked about last time. And a content-rich curriculum is equally as important to producing literate learners going forward. So we need both rich experiences and explicit instruction in a structured literacy program with phonics. So the foundation of the structured literacy program is this idea called the simple view of reading. And we looked at this momentarily last time that we were together, but this is a model that was developed back in 1986 that just really kind of helps us to understand the key components that go into reading comprehension, being a literate reader who is able to gain meaning from the text that he or she is reading. And there's two components to this. The first is that ability to decode those words on the page. That's this phonics that we've been talking about. That's being able to look out, sound out, put together those different sounds in a word to understand what the word means. Then you also have linguistic comprehension. That's things like having vocabulary. After you've sounded out the word and you know what the word is, do you know what the word means? Do you know how meaning is built through this process of reading? And ultimately, that leads, as I've said before, to this ultimate goal of reading comprehension. Now, the thing that I want to point out to you in the simple view of reading is that it is decoding times linguistic comprehension that equals the reading comprehension. Now, for those of you that haven't done math in a long time, you'll note that anytime you multiply something by 0, the answer is always 0, right? So if your child does not have the ability to decode the words on the page, but they do have linguistic comprehension because you've done a lot of providing them with some really rich experiences. They've learned lots of words through, very rich oral language that they've heard and that kind of thing. You've done a lot of reading, but they still don't know how to decode. If you hand a child a book, that 0 in ability to decode times that really rich linguistic comprehension is going to equal 0 reading comprehension because they're not able to decode the words on the page to result in that reading comprehension. The same is true, though, if you teach a child how to decode those words, but they don't have that content knowledge, that background, that vocabulary to understand what they're reading as they're decoding it. Again, the net answer here is going to be 0 for reading comprehension. So what we have to have is gains both in the ability to decode the words using phonics and that linguistic comprehension that comes through that content-rich experience so that we get children who have really great reading comprehension ability. Now, I have another expert that I'm going to share a video, and she's going to give us a little bit more understanding of the simple view of reading.
I give lots of workshops all over the country, and I give them on all different aspects of struggling reading. And I start every single workshop with the same introduction, and it's called The Simple View of Reading. It's research that is the most important research, in my opinion, that's ever been done on reading, because it clarifies very clearly what good readers do well and what those who don't read so well struggle with. The simple view of reading is research that was first done in 1990. It was proposed in 1986, and it's been replicated hundreds of times since then. People have tried to disprove it, and they've tried to prove it. They can only prove it. They cannot disprove the simple view of reading. And what it says simply is that reading is made of two components: decoding and language comprehension. In order to be strong at reading comprehension, you got to be strong at decoding, and you got to have background knowledge and understand the words that you're reading. If you are the most brilliant person in the world and you understand physics and you can draw pictures and you can't decode the words, you can't achieve reading comprehension. You only have language comprehension. Decoding is also a critical skill. You must be able to read the words accurately. I work in Africa sometimes, helping develop programs for languages that children in rural Africa speak. They are languages I don't speak: Fulfulde, Kanuri, Wolof, Bular. They have what's called a transparent orthography. That means one letter always spells the same sound, not like English where one letter can spell a number of sounds. I can decode those languages perfectly. You tell me that a C spells ch, and I can read any word, because the vowel A always spells ah. The vowel O always spells O. So I can read cho. I don't have a clue what those words say. I don't know one word in Wolof, but I can read a whole page. I can decode a whole page. So I've got decoding, but I don't have any language. I can't get to reading comprehension. So the simple view of reading tells us two things. We have to be strong in decoding, and we have to have strong language knowledge. We have to know something that helps us know what the words are. Researchers all know about the simple view of reading. Teachers don't know about it. And it's the most important thing that teachers, if they would understand that students must be strong decoders, that means you don't guess your way through material. You can decode unfamiliar words. It means that you know what you're reading about. They would understand then that if you have a tier 2 student, meaning that student has a little bit of reading problem, not a severe reading problem, they would not say all tier 2 students go into the same program. Whoa, you're a tier 2 student and you're in 3rd grade. We're going to put you in Read Naturally. Read Naturally is right for some students, but we don't know, because all we have is that they're a tier 2 student, meaning they're behind in reading comprehension. We got to dig further and find out, is that a decoding problem or is that a language problem? And we teach those two things separately, and we test those two things separately. And that's something that teachers, they don't carry that with them. And if teachers could carry that with them, they would, number one, know they've got to teach decoding until it's very strong. They cannot let kids guess their way through text. The second thing they would know is that when a student isn't performing as well as we want them to, we don't say what's wrong with their reading comprehension. We say, I wonder if the problem is decoding or language comprehension. And that is the most important knowledge that we have from research that is absolutely applicable to teaching, that teachers don't know about. If teachers understood the simple view of reading, they would know that when a child has a reading difficulty, they're not performing as well as we want them to on a reading test, we have to dig deeper. And the first thing we ask is the problem that the student has difficulty decoding? Is the problem that the student doesn't understand what they're reading, or do they have both problems? And if they have both, then we have to address them differently with separate kinds of interventions. Decoding is finite, and we teach decoding. You can read words that you don't even know what they mean. You're a strong decoder if you can decode them. Like I'm a really good decoder in Wolof and Ofolde and Kanuri. Don't know anything about the language, but I'm a very strong decoder even in those languages. If the problem is language, obviously for me, the problem is I have no vocabulary. So that would be easy. Teacher what the words mean. If I get a student who speaks English and I know that they have a language problem, how do I know they have a language problem? Because their reading scores are low and they're strong decoders. It's simple algebra. It has to be language. The problem has to be language. Well, then, just like the simple view of reading says, well, the problem's reading, is it decoding or language? If a student has a weakness in language, I ask 2 questions. Is it a vocabulary background knowledge difficulty, weakness, which is relatively easy to fix? Or is it reasoning and syntax, that the student just doesn't get it, even though they know what the words mean, but they just miss the idea? One is pretty easy to fix. The other is more difficult to fix. There are a number of tools that we can use. Unlike decoding, language is not finite. Every day, we're all learning something new. Just by experience, we're adding to our language comprehension. It's very complex and it's very simple. And the reason I say that is it's complex to figure out exactly where the issue is, but it's very simple. Once you find the issue, you know exactly what to do. Let me give you an example. I was working in a 9th grade special education language arts class, and there were 11 students. 9 of them had decoding issues, very apparent, so fix their decoding, put them in decoding intervention. 2 of them had comprehension issues. One of the ways that when I don't have extensive information, I try to figure out, I just ask students, can you read a paragraph, if they're strong decoders, which these 2 were strong decoders, and tell me what you just read. One of they read a paragraph about alligators and how long they had been in southwestern America, southern and southeastern America, United States, and all about that. So the first girl read it, and she read it, and I asked her, please tell me what you read. And she said, it was a million years. So I said, can you tell me anything else you read? Alligators. So she real clearly is reading and not getting a whole picture of what she's reading. Oh, boy read. He read the passage, and I said, can you please tell me what you read? We have alligators in our bayou right down the house from us, and there are alligators. Do you know, sometimes when they're babies, they only weigh however much they weigh, but they weigh, oh my gosh, they can weigh however much they can weigh. He knew so much about alligators, but he didn't tell me anything he read. He told me just what he knew. So he had exactly the opposite problem that I'm not going to work with them the same. So the way I start with this is I teach kids how to describe a picture. So I held up a picture of a kangaroo, and there's a big kangaroo, and there's a little tree, few trees in the background, and some brown at the bottom. And I said to the girl, could you please describe this picture? She said, there are 3 trees. She just goes into some detail. It's like she didn't even know how to describe. Okay, so then I called the boy up and I said, could you please describe this picture? Oh, that's in Australia. Now, that picture, it might be in Australia, but he's going to bring all of, so I have to address their problems very differently. However, I'm going to use a picture at first to get them to focus on the picture, to tell me about the picture. One of them, I have to keep him in the picture. The other one, I have to show her how to describe different things. And that's just the best example that I can come up with right now to show you how a reading comprehension, a language comprehension problem can be, children can have a low score, and yet the reason for exactly the same low score is very different. I give lots of work.
And so the example there is that, again, it's that ability to decode, also that language comprehension that work together that results in reading comprehension. This model that I have on the screen now, Scarborough's rote model, just expands upon that simple view of reading to break down what's involved in that decoding, word recognition being the decoding part. So you have that phonological awareness, recognizing those syllables, those small units of words, the phonemic awareness, those sounds that are in the words. Then you have the aspect of decoding, which is that alphabetic principle, the idea that these letters on the word represent those sounds and how they go together in terms of spelling, sound correspondences. And then also the sight recognition of familiar words, words like the, that you wouldn't necessarily sound out, but you just kind of read as you're going along. And then in that language comprehension component, you have things like background knowledge that we really talked a lot about, that vocabulary, understanding language structures, how we use language, verbal reasoning, things like metaphors and that kind of thing. And then also literacy knowledge, understanding those print concepts, the genres of different types of literature and that kind of thing. So again, that language comprehension times word recognition. In Scarborough's rote model, he shows how all those strands of those things, as we become increasingly strategic with language comprehension and increasingly automatic with that word comprehension, it builds that very strong rope that represents that skilled reader who's able to fluently read through those words and understand what they're reading. That's our ultimate goal. And so I'm going to end today with just some tips for you guys to think about as you're getting your child ready for kindergarten. We've talked a lot about getting them ready to read, but reading is not everything in terms of getting ready for kindergarten.
A, B, C, D. A lot of parents probably will think teaching them the ABCs or 1, 2, 3s, those are helpful. But I would say even more helpful is social skills and practicing good routine, like going to bed early and waking up on time and going to school on time so that kids don't feel frantic. As well as teaching kids emotions, having them recognize their feelings like I'm upset, or I'm excited, or I'm happy. She's here. She is here, yay. And then later on, we teach things like, oh, I'm frustrated because he took my crayon. So knowing why you're frustrated, then learning about coping mechanisms to help calm and be ready to learn. Exposing their kids to trying new things at home. So just new things every day, just mixing it up, I would say. And then that way in school, when we expose them to new things, they'll be ready for it. Missing a tail. Question them with everything. I have a 18-month-old, and that's what I do at home too. I just say, oh, do you see the clouds in the sky? Oh, do you see the letter 3? Getting them to think, okay, my parents ask me questions. I can ask questions too. Natalie? You can ask them to be a friend? What does that sound like? Parents can easily tell kids, school is fun, or be excited about school for the kids. So that way it projects a positive light about school for the kids, even saying things like, you go to school to learn, so that they know their purpose is to go to school to learn and have fun at the same time. Practicing a healthy goodbye. So being able to say, I'm going to drop you off and then I'll pick you up, just like at grandma's. Or I'll be back for you at a certain time. And so then kids and parents won't feel stress on the first day.
So there's more to just reading and getting ready for kindergarten. There's a lot of facilitating your child developing independence and having some social emotional grit in terms of interacting with others and controlling strong emotions. So some additional tips help him to develop that independence at home. Basically, what you want to do is think about anything your child can do on their own and be successful and have them do it. And oftentimes, young children, are capable of doing much more than we think they can. A lot of times it's our convenience, or it's just easier for us to do things like, for example, setting the table. But really, your child will benefit from having opportunities to do those things for him or herself. Focus on those self-help skills. That's going to be so important in terms of helping that kindergarten teacher when they're not having to open everything and do everything for your child. They should know how to wipe their face after lunch and not have to be told to do that. How to blow their nose without assistance, but also to be able to ask an adult for assistance as needed. You want to teach responsibility, start transferring those small responsibilities over to your child. Things like after a trip, having them be responsible for putting away the things that were in their backpack, them picking up things in their bedroom, helping with household chores, that kind of thing. And again, young children are capable of doing often bigger tasks than what we really typically think they can. Develop and follow routines. This is going to be so important as you get your children ready for school. You know, school starts at a set time in the morning and goes through the day. And so going ahead and getting your child into that routine of having to get up and to eat breakfast and to be ready to go at that same time that they would be for school, and kind of maintaining that routine goes a long way in terms of getting them ready to transition to school. We've said this over and over and over again: read aloud to your child. Get a library card for your child. Go and check out those books routinely. Make sure that you're reading to your child every single day. Make sure you're reading that variety of books, both story books and nonfiction books and things about science and all those kinds of things. Read the captions under the pictures. Read things to them like in the newspaper or online or that kind of thing. Just read to your children. Engage her in meaningful literacy activities. We've said this before. In addition to just reading, connecting it back to writing, helping them to help you with writing tasks like writing a thank you card, shopping list, that kind of thing. And the big deal there is appreciating their attempts and watching those skills as they develop with practice. Another huge thing is acknowledging feelings. A lot of children go into kindergarten with a lack of ability to really manage strong emotions, and that's so vitally important. But a lot of times children don't know how to manage their strong emotions because they literally don't have the vocabulary to describe the emotions they are experiencing. So feeling anxious, for example. Most young children understand happy, sad, and mad. And when they're feeling anxious, they know that they're not necessarily happy, but they're not really mad or sad. There's some kind of other feeling involved with that. And the fact that they don't have the word to describe it really causes them a lack of ability in managing that. Fred Rogers said, anything human can be discussed and anything discussed can be managed. If you have the ability to talk about it, you have a better capacity to manage that. So validate your child's feelings, talk about feelings, help them to develop strategies to manage those feelings. One thing is the turtle technique. If they, like, somebody bumps into them and they get upset, pulling into yourself, counting to 3, thinking about what's the best way to respond instead of just reacting, goes a long way once they get in that kindergarten classroom and they're having to interact with so many other children. The big deal that I want to leave you with is don't worry. Rather than worry about whether your child is ready to read and write, think about your child as a whole. What can they do well that will help them succeed? A quiet child who has reading abilities will find her way to the social butterfly that needs help writing his name, right? The silly wiggly child will find a spot as the classroom helper. You need to rest assured that they're going to navigate kindergarten together. But your role is to make sure leading up to kindergarten, they have lots of experiences with reading books, you reading to them. They have lots of experiences out in the real world and ample opportunities to play in a safe environment and engage in that fake it until you make it thing that we've talked about through this whole thing. So this is where we're going to end. I encourage you as we're wrapping up is to think of 3 ideas that were new to you or that confirmed your thinking, 2 actions or strategies that you're going to try out with your child as a result of this session, and then any additional questions that you have. We're going to place this recording on our course site so that others can have access to it, and hopefully it will continue to be a resource. I want to thank you so much for participating in our Stand By You Early Learning series. It's been a privilege to work with you guys, and we wish you the very best as you move forward into this next step of transitioning to kindergarten.